with this whole sexual unveiling, as it were, from Freud to Kokoschka and Schiele, this, really revolution in a very staid, repressed Europe.
What is amazing is how each of the three artists brought different insights into human unconscious mental processes. When you look at Klimt's paintings, they're stylized, they're subtly erotic, but not frankly erotic. When you look at his drawings, they're amazing.
Yes.
They reveal, in a way that Freud did not understand, that women have an independent sexual existence. They can please themselves by engaging with men, by engaging with women, and by just pleasuring themselves. And his nudes are done with such delicacy and grace and thoughtfulness that he clearly had enormous insight.
Empathy.
Into the
empathy into the subject.
Absolutely. Into the female mind, which Freud simply didn't have. Didn't have. He didn't get it. He absolutely didn't get it. He thought that women had a restricted sexuality, and they had penis envy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, Klimt never did a self-portrait, never examined himself in works of art. May not have examined himself in other areas as well, but Kokoschka was really the first of the trio to do self-portraits. And he did a number of self-portraits that are really quite remarkable. So he had this important affair with Alma Mahler, which really helped push him toward the peak of his career, an extraordinary portrait painter. He painted a number of portraits of himself. And the portraits of himself are remarkable because they show his immense insecurity. He has his fingers in his mouth. He knows that sooner or later he's going to leave her. The Tempest in Basel, they're lying in this raft. She's peacefully asleep, having a grand old dream. And he is a nervous wreck. Sure, she's going to jump overboard or something like that. And she ultimately, of course, did with him as she did with many other men. But the honest way in which he revealed himself was really quite striking. And he used not only facial expressions, but also hand gestures. By the way, I left out another amazing thing that Klimt had, the insight into female sexuality. He realized not only did they have capability for sexual pleasure, but they also had capability for sexual aggression. This fantastic painting, which I think is Klimt's greatest painting, Judith and Holofernes.
Oh, yes.
It shows that after Judith, this modest widow, had decapitated Holofernes, who was having a siege on a small town near Jerusalem, she went to save her people, and she got him drunk, and they had sex together, and then she cut off his head. Traditionally, this is depicted as a heroic act that she did against her own, better instincts in order to save her people. But in the Klimt painting, her breasts are revealed. She's wearing elegant Wiener Werkstätte clothing, and she fondles his head in a post-coital trance. Just an absolutely amazing painting, absolutely amazing. So he knew many aspects, castration anxiety writ large right then and there, that women not only had erotic capabilities, but they could fuse that with aggression. Kokoschka picked up with the examination of oneself and beginning to introduce hand gestures. Schiele went one step further. Schiele thought that the exploration of self involved the whole body.
Yes.
And so he used his whole body in artificial gestures often to convey emotions, and many of these were done nude. Yeah. He had a period around 1910 or 1911 in which he did 50 or 60 self-portraits, a number of them nude, masturbating, unheard of to have a male self-portrait masturbating. He depicted the existential anxiety of modern life. Yes. Even when he was making love, even in moments of presumed pleasure, there was angst all over the place.
What you're bringing to light here is that the emergence of the awareness of one's body as part of the mind-body relationship. There's I think the bridge here that takes place in beginning at that period and going forward, which continues to be sort of the fascination of our culture. Now more globally, we're linking mindfulness from ancient Buddhist, contemplatives to the neuroscience to look at our bodies and our sense of self and our connection to each other.
That's a very good point.
And
Yep.
I think,
Yep.
this sense of how fragile we are as bodies, and that the mind-body link, we're one thing. And art somehow takes many diverse things and makes it a one thing for you to get a glimpse of and to reflect, on yourself. My own thought about, mindfulness, reflection, although it may have formally organized in India 5,000 years ago, paintings activate mindfulness. That's 40,000 years ago.
Sure.
So that process of looking in and connecting to the embodiment and then connecting that self to the system of society, I think is one of the roles art plays in culture. You have set a platform for this period, and one of my reactions to the book was, and look what happened after this golden age. Within a few years, the Archduke is assassinated, the 500-year aristocracy begins to collapse, science in some way contributes to destruction but also contributes to saving it, as does art. Duchamp's urinal makes sense of the end of Europe as we know it. I'm curious, as a scientist, artist, we're both doctors in training, talk about the creativity of a scientist. You're a Nobel Prize winning scientist. Talk about the creativity that goes into scientific discovery and exploration.
I think that's really hard. I mean, one is largely oblivious of one's own capability for creativity. I mean, I find it pretentious to speak about my own creativity. I have ideas, and some of them are good and some of them are not, and the fortunate thing about science is it allows you to distinguish between the two. One of the problems I've had with psychoanalysis, which I like a great deal, is it's more difficult to do, as Freud would have been the first to tell you. I think that people who go into science like to play with ideas, and they like to play with ideas by themselves, but one of the wonderful things about science, it gives you a vocabulary whereby you can communicate those ideas with others, and one gains an enormous amount by social interaction. Right. So in that way, it probably differs in a certain degree. There is a similarity in the sense that every painter stands in the history of art. Yes. So they learn from other artists. You can see this even more clearly, for example, in composers, in which, clearly, many composers have borrowed from their predecessors very freely. Certainly this occurs here, although it's less obvious. And this happens in science all the time. So one is interacting with it, but in science it's more obvious. Because it often is you're interacting not just with the past, right, because that's already dead. You'd want to do something new, right, but you're acting with your contemporaries. Yes. And I've been enormously influenced, and I've benefited enormously from my interactions with my peers at Columbia and elsewhere.
One of the things that I think maybe Freud exemplified, and you write about him struggling to link science and art, in my own experience, that science is an outward-looking, shared, creative exploration of the world. Art requires a turning in, listening to your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, not necessarily conscious of them. A lot of art, I think, as having made a lot of art myself, a lot of it I don't know why I made it until later I see, oh my God, that's about this or that. So there is...
I think there are similar things going on in science. I think Ernst Chris, who was interested in the creative process, spoke about a regression in the service of the ego. Yep. He said, often you're working very hard at a problem, working very hard, and no progress. You go for a walk on Ringstrasse, right? And an idea comes to you. You take a shower, an idea comes to you. You have a fantasy, and often that happens. And that happens to scientists as well. You have a conversation and it doesn't even come up, and when you leave it, you think about a dimension that you didn't have before. Yeah. So I think that kind of stuff, probably it's the same sort of biological process that's involved. Mm-hmm. In fact, I did a program once with Chuck Close and Richard Serra.
Yes, I saw that.
And with Charlie Rose, and they refused to refer themselves as being creative. Now, these are phenomenally creative people. They felt themselves creating problems and solving them. They saw themselves as we scientists see ourselves. And in my own personal thing, since I come from the same background you do, I went to medical school for one reason and one reason only. Ernst Chris convinced me that if I wanted to understand what happened in Vienna in 1938, intellectual history, which I was doing at Harvard, wasn't going to get me there. You want to understand the human mind, you have to understand it on an analytic basis. Right. And he got me interested in psychoanalysis. And because of him, I went to medical school. Wow. And my whole career in medical school was to become a psychoanalyst. Yeah. And only in my senior year did I say, you know, even a Park Avenue psychoanalyst should know something about the brain. Right. And I took an elective at Columbia with a guy called Harry Grunfist. First time I ever worked in a lab, and I said, wow, this is great. I remember having dinner with my wife before we got married and saying to her, you know, this would be a nice way to make a living, but it's ridiculous. You don't have any money, I don't have any money. She said, money, it's of no significance whatsoever. I can assure you she's never uttered those magic words again.